I call the whistle wall.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker, and thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this third reading of the Electronic Monitoring of Offenders legislation bill, which, as we've heard, was divided into three bills at the committee stage. So the Corrections Electronic Monitoring of Offenders Amendment Bill, the Parole Electronic Monitoring of Offenders Amendment Bill, and the Sentencing Electronic Monitoring of Offenders Amendment Bill. Labor does support this particular piece of legislation. And I think it is worth reiterating why this bill was required and who it actually is relevant to. And so electronic monitoring is about providing people who are either exiting prison or under this piece of legislation have had intensive supervision imposed on them. And it also will now cover people who are being released from prison who have a sentence of 2 years or less. Currently, those people are not eligible for electronic monitoring, and in fact that represents 5,800 prisoners in our justice system. Currently, we have 2,000 people who have electronic monitoring devices in the community, so this piece of legislation potentially could double, if not treble, the amount of people in our community who are undergoing electronic monitoring. So the extension of the eligibility is really about transitioning people out of prison and enabling us to feel secure as a public, that those people who may have had to stay in prison for a little bit longer are actually monitored in some form. And the definition of electronic monitoring is really interesting, and I'll read it. It is a general term referring to the forms of surveillance with which to monitor the location, movement and specific behaviour of persons in the framework of the criminal justice system. I'd particularly like to draw to the House's attention in this, the third reading, of someone who I have tremendous respect for, and that is Kim Workman, who made a submission on behalf of the Robson Hannon Trust for the Rethinking Crime and Punishment project. And he did have some reservations about electronic monitoring and the expansion of electronic monitoring as a tool for releasing prisoners into the community. And from his perspective, if electronic monitoring became an end in itself, Mr Speaker, and didn't ensure that prisoners who were released were done so with a proper reintegration strategy and received adequate support, then this legislative measure was actually not going to help in reducing the rates of reoffending. And what we do know, and particularly for Māori, is that 5 years after release, unfortunately 81% of Māori who have been in prison actually reoffend and end up in prison again. So if this piece of legislation and electronic monitoring serves to address that issue, then obviously we as parliamentarians would have thought that this piece of legislative reform was exactly what we wanted to achieve in terms of setting some aims and objectives of reducing reoffending. And the stated objective is to reduce reoffending by 25%. So what we hope is that in addition to electronic monitoring, that when people are released, they're actually released to a home, that they have somewhere to go to. And we've seen there have been some pilots recently, because I didn't realise that 20% of prisoners actually are in there because of driving issues, whether it be licensing issues, whether it be fines that they haven't paid. Some of them it's dangerous driving, but 20% of our prison population, actually it's because of driving issues. So we would hope that when people are released into the community, that having an opportunity to get their driver's licence actually is something that we also provide, that they have drug and alcohol counselling if that's what they need, that they have education and employment opportunities. And so it's worth noting at this reading that these were some of the discussions that we had at the Select Committee, and particularly by Dr Kim Workman. I'd also like to note that there was a Bill of Rights issue about this particular piece of legislation, and that related to people who had been released on extended supervision orders. And that particular terminology is really important because the people released on extended supervision orders have been released after they'd completed their sentence. And so these are high-risk sex offenders and very high-risk violent offenders who have to be released back into the community. We have to release them. They've served their time. And so for this particular group, the Bill of Rights contention was that we were actually limiting their freedom of movement. And in some ways, this was a double jeopardy, then requiring them to be electronically monitored. But the committee in this House has seen fit to say that that limitation for this particular group was justified because of the threat that they pose to the community. And so I think people have talked about a few instances in this House. I think the bigger issue really is about sentencing, people being sentenced adequately. And the other part of the equation is, are people being rehabilitated adequately? And so those will be the continued, I believe, challenges to the justice system within that specific context. But overall, Mr. Speaker, I think that we've had a fairly robust debate and discussion about this piece of legislation. I think that there are still challenges about the actual bracelets themselves, how effective they are. Obviously, some of my colleagues have highlighted members of the public who have been able to cut through those bracelets. But I think overall, as a parliament, we are supporting the use of technology. But coupled with that use of technology, I think this is a good point to restate that from our perspective, that has to be coupled with rehabilitation, with the reintegration strategies, and actually supporting prisoners when they are released into the community to make sure that if that's their first time in prison, that it's actually their last. Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.